Gerry Georgatos is a suicide prevention researcher and national coordinator of the National Indigenous Critical Response Service and has closely worked with First Nations peoples in and upon their release from the prison system. He'll be taking part in next month's Naming and Addressing Racism event, which will bring together respected guests from around Australia and the US who will share their insights and knowledge in a series of panel discussions and workshops. Gerry starts off our chat by explaining what he's witnessed in his travels and the impacts of racism in regional and remote Aboriginal communities.
I've travelled hundreds of communities, homeland communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, First Nations, First Peoples, and I've been to more communities across the continent than most Australians actually have. And sadly, over the last 2 or 3 decades that I've been travelling communities, I've seen a horrific increase in the number of deaths by suicide, and an increase in young people losing their life to suicide than was the case a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago. So officially, 1 in 18 of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths is a suicide. 1 in 18, it's a horrific, harrowing, staggering statistical narrative. And then to be much more authentic, much more real, it's more likely 1 in 10 because of underreporting issues and the need for perennial determinations on the basis of evidence gathering. There's an underreporting of it and it's around 1 in 10. But whether it's 1 in 10 or 1 in 18, this is amongst the world's highest suicide rate from a racialised lens. And then we've got the losing of people to other unnatural deaths at a horrific rate, much higher than even the suicide rate. So I've seen the grim reality on the ground, and I've worked in the suicide prevention space right across the space in terms of migrant suicides, which also constitute more than one quarter. There's about 800 suicides of Australians who are migrant-born, who were born overseas. They're lost in translation, and that's a veil and layer of racism in itself too. They're being lost in translation. Most household Australians not knowing that more than 800 of Australia's near 3,000 suicides per year are of migrants, of people born overseas. And there's the children of migrants, Australian-born children of migrants, who are at elevated risk and higher rates of suicide than other Australian children.
As you say, so many people living in this country are so far removed from the realities of what's happening to people who are suffering and experiencing such extreme hardship. What kinds of feedback do you receive from these people when you visit them? Are they feeling like people have turned their backs on them?
Well, it's the most pertinent question that could be asked, what you've just asked, Lisa. The reality is that the social and political debates that occur about racism or that occur about neglect or that occur about the human condition rarely include the voices of the oppressed and of the most oppressed. And this is actually internalized as grief or whatever, right? It's a toxic translation as racism, and it compounds the trauma of the fact of deprivation in the first instance, of the fact that they live in corrals of human misery and suffering and in a condition that has actually spawned the highest suicide rates in the country and around the world, and has led to high arrest rates, jail rates, to all sorts of aberrant behaviour and so forth. But people not being included, and by a censorship of omission, and I'd like to describe what I'm talking about, a censorship of omission. We often hear in the media that we've got to actually tell the good news stories, or the media's telling the good news stories about the ways forward and the affirmative actions for many who were vulnerable. But the most vulnerable still remain in that 40% that I talked that live below the poverty line. And then there's the extreme poverty that many remain within or whatever, right? That's actually of a third world akin nature, a dirt poor, deep poverty. It's actually a surprise in the 12th largest economy on the planet or whatever, because this is what we are, the 12th largest economy on the planet and one of the wealthiest nations on the planet, and yet we have third world akin conditions. And they go unheard. But what I'd like to talk about is the veils and layers of racism and how the media, by censorship of omission and by misunderstood narratives, is actually playing a part in that. So we've got an onus today on wanting to tell more good news stories, as if this is a way forward for those who are living way below the poverty line or whatever, right? And that they can somehow lift themselves from that poverty, but from communities where that's actually impossible, where they've been deprived of opportunity and pathways to opportunity, where they've been deprived of education, which is actually the most powerful protective factor to actually navigating your way through our two cultural settings, that of the mainstream and that of their own cultural setting, of their own local identity. And this toxically plays out. It compounds trauma. It's a constancy of trauma. It's ongoing. Its identity is a liability. And my thing has always been to tell the grim reality stories, because if we do not tell the grim reality stories of the people being left behind, of the conditions that they're being degraded into and left into, because the making of these conditions is not of their own making, but of the making of one government after another, because it is the responsibility of others to actually provide the infrastructure to communities, to provide the level of service in a community equivalent to that of the rest of the nation's communities. I'll give an example. You've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities living 100 kilometres apart from non-Indigenous communities, or where the communities of its residents are predominantly non-Indigenous. And one community, the non-Indigenous, actually has a quality of service equivalent to that of any regional country town or an urban mass. And the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community is almost third world akin. It is minimalist services, and it is limited to a few programs, and it is limited to the reductionist or to utter deprivation. So that disparity is contrived. That disparity is in contrast to the non-Aboriginal community that has the level of service that you'd expect rightfully in this nation for any community.
You're coming to Adelaide to be a part of the Naming and Addressing Racism Forum. I think a lot of people, when they think of racism, they think of bullying, taunts in primary school, and a very direct and explicit showing of racism, but it feels like in the examples that you've given, it sounds like a passive response to helping these people, and ignoring them is also a very racist response.
It's the worst form of racism. I grew up, I'm 56 years of age. I grew up as a migrant child in Sydney, even though I live on the other side of the continent now and have travelled the world in between that. But I lived in a period of time where racism was still at its full, where the colour of your skin was actually, for what we argue today as passive racism or casual racism, was a common form of racism at that time in terms of the pigment of your skin and what was said around that, of your cultural identity, and your identity became a liability, and there was a period of exclusion, and there was a period of difficult circumstance, and there was a period of diminution for migrant families and so forth. But I've travelled this country and I found that it's a lot worse in the decades since for brothers and sisters who are First Nations. And my view has always been something that my father said as a young child. He said, one day you'll grow up and you'll see the rest of this nation. And I'm talking about a father who was speaking to a son in the late 60s and early 70s. And you'll see that the racism that we feel and the racism that we have been dished out is much worse for our black brothers and sisters. So I grew up near Redfern. And I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, and I mixed it with people from all backgrounds, First Nations brothers and sisters, migrant brothers and sisters of all sorts of culturally diverse and language diverse backgrounds. And, it was a difficult period, and it's a period that actually made you feel different. I've seen much transition, but sadly much of what's been fought for and what's been fought for the hardest, and rightfully so that it should be fought for, but not necessarily harder than what I'm about to argue, is a lot of it's symbolic. A lot of it is about language, a lot of it is about terminology, a lot of it is about affirmative actions, and a lot of it is about supporting those who have a capacity to actually, more capacity and agency amongst their Anglo-Celtic brothers and sisters. They actually lived a privileged existence because of the terms of reference of this country, in terms of its modernity, in terms of the last couple of 100 years, and particularly since Federation. But we have lost our passage and our agency on behalf of brothers and sisters who don't have that same type of agency, who their grim reality is one of third world conditions, who are living in corrals of human misery and suffering, who are living in the utmost deprivation, that suicide is an option, that aberrant behaviour is a relief, and that aberrant behaviour can bring them into confrontation or into circumstance that can lead them into jails. and a revolving door and offending and going in and out of prison, spending an aggregate of decades in their prison life before they've even turned 40 or 50. So I visit the prisons and I work with prisoners who would have had themselves the marginalised and the downtrodden. And look, I've got to actually take out the statistical narrative of the extent of incarceration in this country. In my own research, I've inverted from rates to crude totals, so Australians can actually better understand, instead of hearing 14 or 15 or 16 times the rate of non-Indigenous, to understand the extensiveness of incarceration in this country and the racialised nature of that incarceration, and the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being incarcerated, or nearly 100% of them are also from that 40% that live below the poverty line, their brothers and sisters. But in Western Australia, we have 1 in 13 of all First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander males in prison today. From a racialised lens, that's the highest in the world. That's higher than the African American jailing rate of adult males in the United States. And 1 in 7 of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons in this country have been to jail. 1 in 7. And in South Australia, it's 1 in 6. In the Northern Territory and in Western Australia, it's between 1 in 5 to 1 in 6. 1 in 4 of all Aboriginal males in this country, 1 in 4 have been to jail. So these are the compounding factors, the constancy of trauma. And prison isn't a positive experience. It's the most negative experience imaginable. These are corrals of human misery, dungeons where people are left to rot. And I do much in the prison experience and post-prison release. And this also explains why there's a higher rate of suicide and unnatural death post-prison. We often hear about deaths in custody, and they're an abomination in itself, people taking their lives because they can't see any light at the end of the tunnel with the prison experience. And in the first year post-release, people who have come out in that first year post-release, former inmates, in that first year are 10 times more likely to suicide or die an unnatural death than in any time while in the custodial predicament. And it's the majority of those deaths, of those suicides, of those unnatural deaths will be in the first 8 weeks post-prison. So we don't do anything for people in the ways to improve their lives to the extent that we should while they're in prison. They come out worse than what they went in my experience, in a general sense. And I also work, and I've also fostered a lot of programs post-prison release, and I'm also working closely with the Nullamire Aboriginal program led by a Noongar man, Mervyn Eads, who actually spent 18 years of his life in and out from 13 years of age to 31 years of age. He's now 47. He's a brother. He'll be at that conference with us, and he's coming to Adelaide to attend the event and be in the audience. He's actually now just recently set a record for funding that I've actually got for him or whatever, and a program that we've worked on that he's actually led, and he's provided the intense mentoring and built the shared understandings with employers that have got more prisoners, more recently released prisoners, former inmates, with a radical approach through training to employment and into ongoing full-time employment, and the first employment for many of them in their lives across the line. He set a national record last year for the most number of former inmates across the line into full-time employment, and he's changing lives. Canberra recently said to me, or whatever, well, Canberra being the federal government who I was there with, and they said, congratulations, Gerry and Mervyn, for what you guys have actually achieved. And we should do a lot of media about this. And my response back was, this is actually an indictment and sad that our achievement is seen in such great light, when in fact one of the major reasons we actually achieved this result so fast and set a national record is because the bar was so low. The bar was so low, and investment has not been made into the most marginalised and into the downtrodden and into our people who finish up in prisons, mostly because of a tsunami of poverty-related issues, the majority of them because of extreme poverty, the majority of them because of that neglect of their poverty in the world's 12th largest economy, and that toxic translation is racism and all the compounding traumas, the composite multiple traumas, the degeneration to aggressive complex traumas, and that we haven't gone through the psychosocial behavioural changes of the radical approach of believing in people in the ways that we should and making the investments to transform their lives and to give them the opportunity that they in life were denied because of this nation's deprivations and imposition of those deprivations on peoples who have been immorally denied that opportunity. Just to give you an extent of some of the radical type change that's actually occurred, in April of last year I went into Acacia Prison, a Perth prison, and spoke to 12 soon-to-be-released First Nations prisoners, and I talked to them about believing in themselves and that we would believe in them, and about a radical approach to changing their lives within weeks. These folk had been in 3, 4, 5 times. Most of them were in their mid-30s. They had already done aggregate 15 to 20 years of prison or juvenile detention and adult prisons in their young lives, and lives not yet half-lived. And 3 of them were actually out the next day. That was a Friday. They just made it in time to sign up with one of the Nullameyer's programs on the Monday. 10 weeks after my sitting opposite them in that particular prison, all 3 of them were employed for the first time in their lives because of a radical belief in ourselves that we could transform rather than go through the piecemeal and minimalist outcomes. We went for the whole hog and also supported them with intrafamilial issues and other stuff. If we want to better understand what holistic means, we can have a discussion about this at another time. But they went within 10 weeks of that visit, where we sat opposite each other in Acacia Prison, to working full-time, and they're still now, almost a year later, working full-time, earning between 3,000 to 4,500 per week in remote housing construction, one in Jigalong, in the heart of Western Australia's remote, another one on a mine site at 3,500 per week, or whatever, and another one driving trucks in the remote and working in scaffolding and plant machinery. And they've transformed not only their lives but that of their families and of others around them. And since then we've set a national record in that. But that national record is just a raindrop of the number of people that we need to help. And it will take a cultural shift in the mindset of our nation to actually galvanise our governments to do more of what they should be doing.
Gerry Georgatos, Suicide Prevention Researcher and National Coordinator of the National Indigenous Critical Response Service. If this conversation has caused distress, contact Lifeline on 13 11 14, that's Lifeline on 13 11 14, or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 4636. You can also visit the Beyond Blue website at beyondblue.org.au.